would you say that there's more freedom when it comes to the instrumentation of horror elements? Or not specifically ones that you'd find in horror movies, but when you're having, for example, in Tomb Raider, when you're having those tense moments, when you feel that something is wrong in the game, and when it comes to, I don't know, the story of it or the thematic elements of it, do you have more freedom with the instrumentation, do you feel? Or are the developers, for example, more happy to give you the leeway to try out weird instruments and different things that otherwise you wouldn't really hear?
Yes, I would say with scary music, with horror music in general, you've just got an open sandbox of sounds. Definitely more freedom, and definitely more freedom from the developers as well, in terms of I think it was really after that first Dead Space came out. It's like before Dead Space, there was always a sort of a call sheet with the music, and they would just take the creative influences that they were using for the game, mostly films, and they would just port that over to music. So whatever films they were using as an influence, they'd say, this is the kind of music that we're looking for, the music of those films, which isn't necessarily the best translation with music. And I would always try to do my best to do my own thing, but you also have to be aware of what the developer wants. And after Dead Space came out, it was almost like a switch had been flipped, and it turned into, hey Jason, what kind of sounds do you think would work? What kind of music do you think would work for this game? Even if it wasn't horror, but especially with horror. Because I didn't necessarily want to take Until Dawn, for example, and just redo the same techniques that I used with Dead Space. And to developers' credit,
right,
I've never been asked to double dip that way. They've never said, oh, we love these 5 cues from Dead Space 2. Just make our score sound like that. They never want that. They always want something different. Even if they want to have maybe those emotional aspects of the score, they want it to have its own kind of sound. So that's where having an unlimited kind of instrument set with scary music really plays to my background as a percussionist and kind of a guitarist, because a lot of the things that you hear, especially in Tomb Raider, the first, 15 minutes of gameplay before the main titles, those are all from this big sculpture that I had sort of a friend of mine built with some audio feedback from me, but there are no actual instruments in that. It's just all bowing and tapping and scraping, and it sounds unsettling because there's no set pitch, right? It's not playing
right.
A C minor scale, or it's not playing a diminished chord, or it's not playing even a cluster of notes that you sort of recognize as being music. It's very non-musical, but it's being performed in a musical sort of way. So there are rhythms, and it's kind of got push and pull, and but your brain is constantly listening to it, even if you don't realizing it, trying to figure out what it is and to put it in some sort of a sonic category. And the fact that it's basically undefinable makes you uncomfortable, and your brain just says, get away from that. I don't want to hear that
right.
anymore. I want to hear something pleasing. I want to hear at least a minor chord. And when you deny them of all that, the listeners or the game players, that's where it really takes on its own sort of language and its own interpretation of something. That's why hopefully, like the scary parts of Tomb Raider with that sculpture and sort of sound design thing don't sound like the scary parts of Dead Space, because Dead Space was an orchestra and Tomb Raider had a lot more of sort of found sound kinds of things going on.
Right. I suppose Far Cry Primal is more tending towards the mindset of the Tomb Raider, which I think, for me, for example, the first thing that I sort of managed to grasp onto was the main theme's recorded sounds, where I think you recorded some kind of wildcat or a big cat and then pitch shifted that and then incorporated that into the music, that I don't think I've heard someone use an animal sound like that within an actual theme of that nature. Nothing really pops into my mind, and that was one of the most striking things to me when I was listening to that, is that sounded new, it sounded strange, but I sort of wanted to listen more for it to try and figure out what it is. But yeah, that was really something that I think you really nailed with that. So when it comes to that, when you're layering weird sounds and samples, animal samples with Far Cry Primal, for example, is there like a go-to workflow that you employ to have them sit well with the rest of the sounds that you might incorporate, so synths and orchestra? Is there sort of a general guide as to how you tend to do that?
That's a good question, because workflow and sort of mixing and production, music production, go hand in hand, especially nowadays, where as composers we're expected to do so many different things, all just in the computer. I would say my general workflow for, let's say it's Far Cry Primal, and I'm doing animal sounds, or there were actually a lot of heartbeats, my heartbeat and animal heartbeats that I recorded that are in the game that sound more like bass drums, like a sort of a thing. It usually starts with me thinking, this sounds like a really crazy idea, but what if ... And then I start trying to experiment with either different microphones, because 99% of the time it's not, what if I buy a sound pack of animal sounds or whatever and put them in the computer and start manipulating them. I'm much more interested in recording new stuff just because it's more fun for me. So it was all about getting recordings of things and then experimenting with them in the computer. First, did they sound interesting at all, or did they just sound dumb? And then how could I incorporate them with the music? And the challenge with Far Cry Primal was the music, quote unquote, was literally me rubbing two bricks together, or I had a big bucket of dirt with like a tube microphone on it, and I was jabbing a stick into it and stirring it around in rhythm, right? I made things out of like fire logs. I broke a clay pot and put it in a rope net and sort of jiggled it on the end of a firewood stick, and it kind of went sink, 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 very... I was trying to find authentic sort of sounds that would be easy to recreate in that world, which was pre-Bronze Age, so they didn't have any metal, so everything was bone and wood and animal skin and clay, and I got lots of splinters. I ended up having to buy a pair of gloves when I was doing these things. I was getting blisters from the rocks, and it was definitely not as straightforward as it probably sounds when you listen to it. I think the first suite that I did before I got the job was maybe 10 or 15 minutes of music, and I spent probably 2 weeks on it. It was all live recordings, which is why it took me such a long time. But the funny thing was, I thought of all these ideas. Well, I could do this, or I could do this, and I wanted them to hear all the ideas. And the suite started with conch shell. A friend of mine who plays trombone, he played conch shell, and it was just like a or something like that. But I pitched it down a couple of octaves and put a bunch of reverb on it, and it sounded like a mammoth or something. I thought it was super cool. So that's how I started the demo. And when I was hired, I went to Ubisoft and visited, and they said, now, if it's okay with you, we'd like to play through the demo and just point out some things that we like. And I said, absolutely. And that played, and basically the producer of the game said, as soon as I heard that, I knew you were our guy. And I was like, really? Well, I could have just sent a 5-second like conch shell thing, and then I would have had the job. Great. But my point being, the conch shell by itself is literally like this like this really silly sounding, high pitched, especially indoors because it sounds better outside, very thin, silly sounding sort of instrument. And I didn't know what it would sound like at first, and then when I heard it, I thought, this isn't going to work. But then I experimented with it some more. And the idea being no one else has that conch shell or those kinds of, animal treatments and things like that. So I learned so much from that game, from Far Cry. And that's what I enjoy the most, I think, about having the production and the composition sort of going hand in hand as one infers the other. So I'm thinking about music in my head and how I'm going to produce it, but then I'm also producing sounds and trying to figure out how they're going to play into the music, if that makes sense.